So let's open our Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 11. And there's a real change in the section you probably noticed. Remember last week's study, the first 10 chapters are so pastoral. And Moses really sharing his heart. And they're pretty emotional chapters. And it's a real appeal. And the transitions and changes going into chapter 11. And chapter 11 begins verse 1 with a therefore. So remember the chapter divisions in the Old Testament and the New Testament are not added or put in there by the original authors. They're added later to help us access and turn very quickly to the same spot, like we just did. You know, it just took us a couple seconds. Everybody turned to the same spot. That pre-digital, I guess now it's, digital, you'd be in trouble, right? You just hit the numbers. So that's very helpful for us. But sometimes they're in a place and we think, okay, that thought's done because the chapter's done. But when a chapter begins with the word therefore, what do you do as a Bible student? You realize, well, we're connecting, you know. So what have we been talking about? So we have to remember last week's exhortation, and he warns them, and he's been speaking about how they have to seek the Lord and not turn aside to the right hand and the left hand. Don't be stiff-necked anymore, and how much God's done this great work for them. So chapter 11, therefore, you shall love the Lord your God, which is the great commandment. So God's done all this for you. Now love him, keep his charge, his statutes, his judgments, and his commandments always. And that's sort of a transition statement that the rest of the chapters we'll cover tonight are primarily no longer those pastoral urging or exhortation from Moses, but now a lot of it's a reminder of commandments that have been given or an additional commandments given. So he begins by setting a stage, and this is pretty interesting. Starting in verse 2, he says this: "Know today that I'm not speaking to your children." So who am I speaking? I'm speaking to you. And so that he's setting the stage. I'm not speaking with your children who don't know or who have not seen the chastening of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, his signs, his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt, to Pharaoh. And he reminds them of all the things that they'd seen, how they crossed through the Red Sea, and then God destroyed their enemies. Verse 6, how he destroyed, the earth opened up and destroyed those guys that were rebelling against the Lord. He says, verse 7, your eyes have seen every great act of the Lord which he did. Now, why is that important? Why is it significant as he makes this next exhortation? Verse 1 is an exhortation connected to the previous chapter now. He's going to make an exhortation in verse 8. But the exhortation in verse 8 is based on the fact that you guys have seen this. Remember what Jesus said, to whom much is given, very little is expected. No, he didn't. To whom much is given, much is required. So I'm not talking to your children who didn't cross the Red Sea, or like, you guys are the generation. You saw this. The earth opened up and swallowed these guys that were in rebellion. You saw Pharaoh's armies destroyed. You're the generation. Your eyes have seen it, so you're accountable. Therefore, verse 8, here's the exhortation. You will keep every commandment which I command you today. And I think he's speaking specifically in light of all that's gone on before. They have the law. But now he's speaking specifically. These are Moses' last words. He's appealed to them in the first few chapters. Now he's giving them a charge based upon the fact of what God's already done for you and what you've seen. You're about to enter into the land. God is going to hold you accountable. You need to be obedient because of all that you've seen that the Lord has done. You should keep every commandment which I command you today, that you would be strong and then go in and possess the land which you're crossing over to possess. And that you'd prolong your days in the land which the Lord swore to give to your fathers, to them and their descendants. It's a land that flows with milk and honey. So the blessing of obedience. Just keep what God said. You've seen, you have all these things to draw upon, and you know. If anybody knows, you would know. So go into the land and obey. Now you have some pretty strong object lessons. The earth opened up and ate people who didn't obey. Like, Pharaoh's army was destroyed. You guys were obedient. You were delivered. You draw on the previous experience to help you enter into the next experience. That surely applies to us. All of us can look back in our life. If you walk with the Lord even a small amount of time, you can look back and see many miracles that he's done. And those are experiences that God intends to bolster us as we go forward and look forward and think, well, God already did this and this and this. He didn't bring me this far to just drop me. He's always taking, I can trust in what he's done, and I can look forward into what he's going to do, and I can believe in him and go forward. And so the blessing of obedience. And he tells them that the land where they're going is not like the land of Egypt, verse 10. This is an interesting statement. He says it's a good land, but it's not like Egypt. And primarily, it's because of irrigation. So did you notice this point that he makes when you were reading it? It's very fascinating to me. In verse 10, he said, in Egypt, you sowed your seed and you watered it by foot as a vegetable garden. The Bible teachers get all into, like, what exactly does it mean to water it by foot? And they wonder, were there pedal mechanisms for irrigation? But you got to remember Egypt. How is Egypt primarily irrigated? Well, there's a major river that flows, right? Comes from this high mountain range, and it flows, and it brings all that. Like, we're in a sediment valley, so we know the rich land that we live in, the San Joaquin or Sacramento Valley, this giant valley that has wonderful soil. Why? Because rivers are bringing these rich nutrients coming down from the mountains and depositing here, flooding their banks, then shrinking back, flooding their banks, and depositing all this soil all over the place. Now, 150 years ago, we had 2 million people who came seeking gold and built all these levees and everything, so we're not flooding, hopefully, Lord willing. Amen. Are you with me? Like, we've had droughts, but we can also have floods. We're right at, in a floodplain. So Egypt's like that, and so the Nile is something they depend on. It's their source of water. But God says, Israel, you're not going to have that. You're going to be dependent upon me. It's a really, really interesting thought that Egypt is a place where you could depend upon your natural resources. Israel is a place you got to depend upon the Lord. And he's talking about primarily water. He said, the land where you're going over, verse 11, it's filled with hills and valleys. It drinks water from the rain of heaven. Israel's a wonderful place as long as it's raining. You get rain, you're going to be good. You don't get rain in Israel, you're going to be in a world of hurt in a short amount of time. In Egypt, you've got the Nile. So you've got a constant flow. You could have problems, but you're going to have 7 skinny cows, right, to have a problem. But if you're dependent upon the rain, you get one bad season and you might be in big trouble. So it's a land, verse 12, though, that God cares for. That's going to be distinct for them. So you're going into this good land. God cares for it. Look at verse 12. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it. Interesting about this land. And isn't there a dispute about the land today? People claiming Israel shouldn't be in the land, and they should never have been given the land, and it's our land, and, all these disputes about the land. Well, here's what God said. It's my land, actually. And really, actually, isn't the whole earth belong to the Lord? And he's given this particular piece of land geographically. It's the only piece of land on the planet that God actually states that he's giving to a particular people. And he says his eyes are always on it the whole year. So the blessing of obedience then. If you obey my commandments, verse 13, that I'm giving you, and you love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, then God says, verse 14, and again it's about rain, about water, I'll give you the rain. You'll have the rain in the early season and the latter rain, and you'll gather in your grain and your new wine and your oil so you can have multiple crops through the year. I'll send early rain and water your crops, and as you finish out the year, I'll water them right before they go to fruit. I'll bless you. I'm going to send grass for your livestock. And so, verse 16 then, so then pay attention to yourselves so that your heart's not deceived. Be careful that you're not deceived. Don't turn away to these other gods and worship them, because the Lord's anger, verse 17, will be aroused against you. And what will be the context or the result? In the context, it's about water. So this place you're going is not like Egypt. I'm putting you in a place, you've been in the wilderness, you're dependent upon the Lord, you have manna every day, the manna will cease, but you're going into a land. It doesn't have a reservoir. It doesn't have lake. It has the Sea of Galilee, and there's the Mount Hermon, that watershed coming down into the Sea of Galilee and going along the Jordan River. But that's all on the eastern border of the land. And so all the other side is just dependent upon rain. You need rainfall or you're going to perish quickly. So God said, you need to do what I say. And if you don't, you're going to have water problems. Now, we're living in a state that last year we had the costliest fire. I thought it was worst in the sense of the most devastating or costly fire in California's history. This year, we had the worst fire in the sense of the largest fire in recorded history. A few years ago, we had 3 of the worst drought years ever recorded in California's history. I wonder if God isn't trying to speak to Californians. We're having an election. We're going to elect a governor for our state. Do we care about the law of God? We're making policies in our state. We vote people into office. Do we care about what God says, or do we just want what our lusts tell us that we want? We're going to tell God we don't care about your law? Well, listen, people who reject the Lord and they reject what God has for them, they put themselves outside of the blessing of God. I'm not saying Israel and the United States are equal, or that this is just a fact. God doesn't just do this with Israel. This is all the nations, a number of things. And so it's interesting that Israel specifically told about water. And I didn't see anybody in the state deciding we should pray. I didn't hear any public officials saying we've had the 3 worst years we ever had recorded since we've been recording how much rainfall. We should pray and ask God to send us rain. I wonder how many more years of drought we would have had to have before they decided it was a good time to pray, or it was a time to repent, or it was a time to ask the Lord for help. And I wasn't necessarily praying for rain. I was thankful that God sent us rain, but I'd rather have God send us repentance. We need repentance more than we need water. And we need water really, really bad. We'll die without it, but we'll really die without repentance. So it's interesting looking at this and sort of thinking it in ourselves, of our own context. And God's saying, I'm going to withhold the rain. If you don't recognize me, I'll get your attention. So the exhortation then continues in verse 18 to put the word of God in your heart. Bind the word of God in your heart, in your soul. Put it on your hand. Put it in front of your eyes. Speak to your kids. It's very similar, verse 19 and 20, to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Speak to your children. Get up when you sit down, when you walk, everywhere. Just talk about the word of God. Have it on the doorpost of your house, he says. And then you'll remember what God said, and you'll be careful to keep his commandments, he says in verse 22. So then the blessing of obedience, God will drive out your enemies. Verse 23, he's going to drive out these nations. And he tells them, these nations are mightier than you. He warns them ahead of time. You're going to go up against these guys. This is like a junior high football team going to play the Raiders. Like, you're going down to the Oakland Coliseum, you're playing the Raiders. But don't worry, you'll win. Like, well, we're not going to win. Like, just don't. You're going to walk into the stadium and you're going to look and go, we're not a match for these guys. But God told them ahead of time, I'm going to bless you to drive out nations that are more powerful than you. In verse 24, the same promise he'll later give to Joshua. Moses expresses it at this point. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads, it will be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even to the western sea, it will all be yours. No man will be able to stand against you. And the Lord your God will put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the land where you tread, just as he said to you. And so the blessing and cursing that will be fulfilled later when Joshua brings them into the land. I'm setting before you a blessing and a curse. And this is what the law does. It's conditional. And so you have a curse or you have a blessing. So you'll put the blessing on Mount Gerizim when you go into the land. You'll put the curse on Mount Ebal. And then when you're in the land, one side will pronounce the blessing, one side will pronounce the cursing. And you should be careful to do what I command you. That brings us into chapter 12 as he gets then into more of these exhortations. And there's going to be an emphasis in our chapters about being careful about false worship or false gods or false prophets. This chapter is primarily an exhortation to avoid the worship of false gods. And I think the best way for me, as I was thinking of this chapter and how it is organized, let's start with the end of the chapter. We're going verse by verse still, but start at the end. We'll look at the final exhortation and we'll go back and see how the chapter builds to it. So the end of the chapter, starting in verse 30, he says, take heed to yourselves that you're not ensnared to follow the gods of the land. That when you cut off these people, take heed to yourselves so you're not ensnared to follow them after you've destroyed their gods, and that you do not inquire after their gods, saying, how did these nations serve their gods? I will do likewise. You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way. Every abomination to the Lord which he hates, they've done to their gods. So everything that they're doing, God hates it. God hates every form of their worship. And in fact, he says, they even burn their sons and daughters in the fire to their gods. So whatever I command you, be careful to observe it and don't add to it or take away from it. So Moses is saying, I've instructed you in the way you worship. You're going to go drive out these people. The summary statement of the chapter is, these guys are doing things. You might be tempted to say, well, how did they do it? What did they do? How did they do it? And you'll be tempted to leave what God told you to do and go look at what they do. And he says, everything they did, God hates. This is an important point because some people say, well, all religions are equal. God says here, no, they're not. God says these people are presuming that they're worshiping God or pleasing him. And God says, I hate everything they do. Listen, if you're sacrificing your kids, God hates it. If you're presenting yourself in a hypocritical way, God hates it. There's a lot of things that God hates. He hated what they were doing. They had so many pagan practices that were so immoral that God was actually using the nation of Israel to wipe them out. And we'll see some passages tonight that will remind us of that. That actually Israel coming to the land is the judgment of God upon these nations for their practices. So let's then move back and look at the chapter. So the first 4 verses, God says, destroy their idols. In verse 2, he says, utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you dispossess serve their gods. So every little shrine they have, every little temple that they made, every little idol that they have, everything that you see that they made, you destroy it. When you go to a pagan country today where they have many idols, they're everywhere. If you travel to India, or you travel to Malaysia, or you travel to a place where all the idols are worshipped, you see just so many idols everywhere. Every house has them. And God says, you're going to come in and wipe these people out. There's going to be idols everywhere. You destroy every single thing that you see that relates to worship because it's not for you. It's an abomination, God said. So destroy them. Don't worship the Lord with those things, he says in verse 4. You shall not worship the Lord your God. Doing those practices is not the worship of God. Then he says in verse 5, specifically, God's going to choose a place. Once they're in the land and they're all settled, God's going to choose a certain location where they'll set the tabernacle. And so seek that place. Don't seek all these different places. This is an exhortation Israel did not obey. One of the problems we'll see later when we get into Judges and into the Kings is that you'll keep hearing the phrase high place. There's a high place, high place. A high place means literally a high place. Any place that you get like, that's a little bit higher, they're worshiping something there. The overpass on Laguna, the overpass on Elk Grove Boulevard. I mean, we're in a flat place, but everywhere there's a high place, someone sets up a shrine. That's what he's talking about. So all these little hills everywhere, you get to the top of the hill, there's a worship place. So God says, no. I'm going to set up the tabernacle. That's where you come and worship the Lord. So Moses emphasizes that here. In verse 6, he says, you shall bring these things. Verse 7, you shall do this. But then verse 8, you shall not do. So bring the offerings, bring yourself. But in verse 8, don't do like we're doing right now where everybody's worshiping everywhere. They're still in the midst of consolidating the worship. He said, verse 8, don't do as we're doing here today, every man doing what's right in his own eyes. You've not yet come into the rest and the inheritance. But when you do, make sure that you go to the place, verse 11, where God chooses to make his name abide there. So that's where you bring your offerings. That's where you bring your sacrifices, all your tithes. You come to the Levites, you come to the priests. He makes an emphasis of joy. Verse 7, he says rejoice. Verse 12, he says rejoice. And verse 18, he talks about rejoicing. So this command for worship involves joy. Joy and worship go together. It's a shame when people make church be something that's not filled with joy, because the coming to the Lord or coming for worship is something that is to be joyful and to be a blessing. There's also a repetition of blessing. Verse 15 talks about bring these things as your heart desires according to the blessing of the Lord. Verse 20, he says it's as much as your heart desires, it's for a blessing. And then also verse 21, as much as your heart desires. So the idea would be that you're coming to the place of worship, you're coming to the central location, but if you live too far away and you can't bring your animals all the time on a regular basis, you can only come on the 3 required feast days, you can still eat as much as your heart desires. Just love the Lord. So it's not restrictive. It's actually enjoy the blessing that God has for you. Bring the firstborn to the Lord. Come and worship the Lord at the place. But if it's too far, you come. Don't worry. Just eat the animals that are clean to you. Pour out their blood. Don't drink the blood, but just worship the Lord and rejoice in the Lord and the land he's given you and the blessing that he's given you. And don't think of what the other nations were doing, because what they were doing is an abomination. He makes it clear that as they're spread out, some people will end up, and this will be something he also talks about later, some people will end up living so far away that they won't be able to always be coming to the place of worship. And so he lets them know, listen, you can still slaughter your animals for eating. Every single animal that you have isn't for worship. So you just worship at your house as unto the Lord. You're not offering it as a sacrifice, but pour out its blood. You're not drinking the blood. It's not a pagan practice. But you bring your offerings and your burnt offerings to the Lord at the place, and then when you're at home, you just rejoice in the things that God's given you. Especially verse 30, as we started at the beginning, now having looked at the statements that he makes, go back to the end again. He says, now listen, you've cut these people off, so don't ask yourself, how did they worship? Well, why? He just told you how. He just said, listen, God's going to set a place, this is what you're going to do, and if you're too far away, you come on the days you're supposed to, you bring your offerings there, you don't offer burnt offerings, you're not worshiping at your own house as offering sacrifices, but you still take the animals that you have and have a feast. You're just be celebrating how great God is, how much he loves you, how he brought you here. Don't look at the nations of the land and say, well, they had these cool robes, and they had this person, and he had this little thing, and people get so interested in the way other people, all these little things that they do. And to me, I just think, oh gosh, what an abomination. Why? We're free in Christ. Why would I want bondage? Why would I? Did you see these people have I don't see and I didn't care. I've been free in Christ. Why would I have Jesus. Why do I want anything else? I have the real thing. So their practices are an abomination. So don't worship that way. That's primarily chapter 12. Then chapter 13, again, still dealing with false the danger of false prophets or false religion or whatever. So chapter 13, verse 1 tells a warning. He says, if there arises among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams. Now, I wish I could tell you that this was unique to them, but that phrase, if there arises among you a prophet, prophets rise up. I don't know where they rise up, or like a hot air balloon, or it's like, they're all going to go hot in Albuquerque and all the hot air balloons are rising up. Here you are going fine, and all of a sudden here comes, whoop, I shouldn't reveal my wicked heart, but it's like that. Remember those little clowns with the sandy bottom that you punch them and they go down, then they pop back up? Like the false prophets arise. Hey, I got a message from the Lord for the church. I want to deliver my message from the Lord for the church. And no. So he's going to talk about that. If a dreamer, I had a dream, and my dream's for the whole congregation. I need to tell my dream. Well, what was your dream? My dream's about what other people need to do. I don't think God's going to give you a dream about what other people do. Maybe God will give you a dream about what you're supposed to do. No, he didn't. It ain't about me. It's about other people. No, you're not sharing that dream. I've met so many prophets who rise up and they're false. Many times. Obviously, we believe in the gift of prophecy. We believe God still speaks today. But we test what God says with the Word of God, right? He's going to give us 2 tests in our chapters. We have one here, and then we have one later in Deuteronomy 18. So this isn't everything about this, and neither is chapter 18 everything about the subject, because they're different from each other and they're about the same subject. So neither one of these is including everything, and the New Testament gives us other tests. But in this particular case, he says if somebody comes along and they say, I got something from the Lord, and then verse 1, he says they give you a sign or a wonder, this is going to happen, and it's a supernatural sign. Then he says, look at verse 2, this is kind of shocking. He says, and then the sign or the wonder comes to pass. And they look at this, this is the sign. It's been 100, it's August, it's Sacramento. Tomorrow it's going to be 40. 40, and it's going to freeze overnight, and the high tomorrow is going to be 40 degrees. You go, yeah, right, whatever, we'll see. You wake up tomorrow, it's frozen, and the high tomorrow is 40. You're going to look at the person and go, whoa, man, well, what's your message? Right? They said something that you can't explain. It's a sign. It's supernatural. What was that then? Look at how you test them. Their message. The sign comes to pass, but then they say, verse 2, let's go after other gods. So they might be able to do something supernatural. So how do you test somebody who says something's going to happen and it's supernatural and it actually happens? How do you test them? You listen to the content of their message. And if they're leading you towards the Lord and it's according to the scriptures, and you say, man, that message he gave is exactly in light of what the Bible said. It's what actually I was reading. It's what I've been thinking about. It's what our church was talking about. Well, you think, well, maybe the Lord's speaking. You're like, well, let's seek the Lord together and see how he wants to work this thing out. But if they do something supernatural and then they lead you away from what the Bible teaches about God, they're a false prophet. Even if it's supernatural, even if it's magical, even if they said something nobody else would know. And people have supernatural powers. I've seen it. I've heard it. I've seen it with my own eyes. False prophets have supernatural power. They can many times do things. Sometimes they're phonies completely through and through, and they have no supernatural power. Sometimes they have supernatural power. So that we don't just go, well, look at that. He just made the curtains move, and woo, something supernatural happened. We say, well, what's the content? That's not about Jesus. Well, I'm not interested in it, man. That's false. As far as I'm concerned, I don't care how many supernatural things happen. If it's not directing you to Jesus, don't be interested in the supernatural phenomenon. So he tells them God is putting you to the test in verse 3 to see if you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Are you more interested in the woo? Like, well, that gave me goosebumps. I saw that thing happen. I don't know. I went there. They told me my past and my future, and I've got to go talk to that person. They're false. They're demon possessed. Maybe that's evil, man. That's not the Lord. But people get into those things. They're really interested in it. So God says, "Are you about me? Or are you about whatever you want?" So He says, verse 5, get rid of them. Put away the evil. In fact, it's a capital crime if they bring a message to turn you away from the Lord. He says you should put them to death. So put the last phrase of verse 5. Put away the evil from your midst. We wouldn't allow something like this in the congregation. Recently had somebody approach me and start to tell me about some mystical experience she had during the service. Her first sentence to me, she's new to the church. I think she'd only come once, or maybe she said she'd been here twice, and she came up to me and she said, your father recently died. First words out of her mouth to me after the service in the lobby, your father recently died. And I said, no, my father didn't pass away. My father's alive. She goes, well, while you were speaking, I saw a shadow around you, and it was a mask. It was an older male. I put my hands up and I go, no, you didn't. That is not from the Lord. I don't want to hear a word you have to say. You don't put that on me. I know all about evil spirits. I've seen them. I'm not interested in what you think you're seeing. And it was interesting because it was the Sunday we were talking about walking by faith or walking by sight, going by what you hear, going by what you see. And I said, it's really interesting that you're sitting during a Bible study that's about hearing the Lord, and you're distracted from hearing what God's saying by what you think you're seeing. It's a perfect chance to apply the message to your own life. Listen, you're trafficking in weird things that are wrong and false, and you need to stop because you did not see a male presence around me. There's no such thing. I don't know what you thought you saw. The lights, and she goes, it's not the lights. I saw it. I've seen these things my whole life. And I said, I've seen things my whole life too. I've seen people who are demon-possessed. I've seen things move. I've seen all kinds of things. But what you're saying is false. Why would I speak to someone so strongly like that? I love that person. I want her to be growing. There's no way someone is going to come to the congregation and say, I've got spiritual power, I've got spiritual insight, and make themselves into something. We're never going to allow that. And it wouldn't just be me. If I dropped over dead, we got a ton of people in our congregation that have the gift of discernment. Amen. A ton. And most of you guys are here, right? You'd go, I smell a rat. Not that she's a rat. She's a human being that's blood bought. Jesus died for her. She needs to come out of it. But that spirit that she's trafficking in, that's a familiar spirit to her, that's demonic. And these people still come to the congregation. They still are interested. And so Moses says, when someone rises up and they go, I had a dream, you just go, yeah, I'll be the judge. I'll be the judge. You don't have to say it. You can smile and be nice. Well, tell me about your dream. I'd like to hear about it. And then you listen and you just think, no, that's not the Lord. And you smile and you go, I think it's more important for you to just get in the Word. God said, what does the chaff have to do with the wheat? And he said, the dreams are like chaff, the wheat. And you say, well, wait a minute, Rich, doesn't it say that old men will dream dreams? Yeah, it does say that. But that's exceptional. That's fine. We believe in it, but we'll test it. What do we test it with? The Word. And we'll have some more things to say about that personal experience with that lady, because there's more about it here. So in our chapters, not in this chapter, but later. So put away the evil. In fact, verse 6 says, even if it's your brother, or the son of your brother, the son of your mother, the son of your daughter, even if it's your wife, even if it's your best friend, if somebody, even how close they are to you, if they say, let's go follow someone else, he said, you need to rat them out. Like, you need to say, hey, this person, even if it's your very best friend, your closest friend, to say, hey, man, we should go check out the Ouija board. What? Hey, I was reading tarot. I have this friend I work with. She told me some things. And at her desk, she pulled out her tarot card. She told me things no one would ever know. You should do. No. Even if it was your son or your grandchild, right? I mean, but what do people do when when there's supernatural power, people are, oh, I can't believe that. I've seen it, Christians. Listen, I talk to people all the time. I talk to people till they get really tired. All of you are awake right now because we're talking about spiritual things. But I want to tell you, you can have half the audience falling asleep if you're doing good doctrine. And I say, let me tell you about the time I cast a demon out of a person. Man, everybody, what? Wait, you did what? Did he say demon possessed? What? And all of a sudden, they're like, what happened? I want to hear about that. Boy, human beings are interested. So Moses said, you be careful about this stuff. You'll be ensnared. It's a trap. It's a snare. You're drawn into it, but you take the bait and then, poof, right? It's a snare. You're caught by it. So be careful, no matter the source. And then the last part of the chapter, starting in verse 12, he says, if you hear someone in your cities, even if it's a whole city, you could have a whole city that gets into this stuff, a whole city that's known for occultism or seeking these things or leaving the Lord. He said, if it's a whole city, destroy the whole city. If it's your best friend, deal with it. Even if it's a whole city, take all their stuff out and put it in a pile, destroy the city, and then make it a heap and leave it there as a marker that you'll say, man, we're going to follow the Lord. So pretty strong exhortation in chapter 13 about keeping your focus on the Lord, and don't let any supernatural power keep you away from that. Chapter 14, he begins with this exhortation to be holy. You're the children of the Lord your God, verse 1. That's going to be an emphasis here. There's separation. And in particular, in verse 2, it's related to the pagan practices of mourning the dead. He says in verse 1, you shall not cut yourselves or shave the front of your head for the dead, because you're a holy people to the Lord your God. And the Lord's chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So don't be slicing yourself and pouring out your blood as you're grieving the loss, as though there's some kind of a pagan practice you're going to do for the dead. I've cut my hair, I've cut myself, I'm marring myself, because this isn't just expressing grief. This is a pagan occultic practice. He said, you belong to the Lord. You're a special treasure. So don't do that. Chapter 14 has an extended list, again, of the unclean animals, and we've covered this before. We have a whole list of them, if they chew the cud and divide the hoof, and some animals do, some animals don't, some do one but not the other. All the birds are described there, what you can eat from the water. But it all comes down to verse 21. In the middle there, he says, near the end, he said, you are holy, a holy people to the Lord your God. So just like don't mar yourself when someone dies and do that practice, also you're eating what I told you, and we've already covered it. So he's reminding them in Deuteronomy as they're going into the land, these are your dietary laws, and the reason is you're set apart to the Lord. So when someone asks you, why don't you eat that? And you're like, well, this is our identity. We're the people of God. God told us what we're supposed to eat, and we don't eat that. And remember, we talked about this already. Jesus made all foods clean. So he said it's not what goes into the man that defiles the man. What defiles us? What comes out of our mouth, which came out of our heart. That's the defiling happens in the heart, not the gut. Now, the gut can have other stuff happen to it. You can get a bunch of cholesterol. You can have a heart attack and die. I mean, Twinkies are not healthy, so they may be ceremonially fine to eat, but I'm pretty sure if you eat them, you'll die. I don't know. I don't even know what they're made of. The company went out of business, right? But then someone picked it up and said, I'll take that recipe, and they're still making them. So some food's clean, some food's not clean, and the reason is you're separated to the Lord, you're a holy people. Verse 22 then begins a teaching on the tithe. They were to bring 10%. He reminds them in verses 22 and 23 that you'll bring the 10th. That's what the word tithe means. You're bringing 1/10 of everything that the Lord has given you. You bring it to the Lord, and you will eat before the Lord. So they would bring this. It would be for the Levites. It would be to help support the Levites. But it was also something that they would. It was a big celebration, and they would all come and be blessed. And then verse 24, Moses anticipating the future, that in the future you're going to be all spread out. So if the journey's too long, we already saw that earlier about the sacrifices. So if the journey's too long and you can't come all the time, you can't carry the tithe of all the grain, then he says, verse 25, exchange it for money and then bring the money. It'll be easier to transport the money than all the grain or whatever other of your tithe that you're bringing. And then bring the money and go to the place that God chooses. And then look at verse 26, and then spend that money for whatever your heart desires. Oxen, sheep, wine, or similar drink, whatever your heart desires, and eat there before the Lord your God. You will rejoice, you and your household, and you shall not forsake the Levite who's within your gates, because he has no inheritance. So if you live really far away and it's not practical to bring loads of grain and make a journey from the upper Galilee and go all the way down to Jerusalem, then convert it to money and come down with your money and present it before, like, buy what you want. And then the giving to the Lord is a big celebration. It's not a burden. It's so tragic when spiritual leaders or religious leaders they want to see things happen, and so they put the guilt on the people, and they become heavy-handed in their tactics to get money, or they're so stressed out about the lack of resources that there's just like this tension, and then it goes to the people, and then everyone's tense, and giving is supposed to be, whoa, like he says, whatever your heart desires. And you get the idea that they're coming, it's just a big celebration. And what are they doing? They're giving to the Lord. Oh, look what the Lord gave us. Whoa, we're giving it to the Lord. Giving should be joyful. So, by the way, if you're struggling with that, don't give. Just say, Lord, I'm a miser. I'm a stubborn, hard-headed miser, and I don't trust anybody, and I'm bitter. And just tell him that you're like, I'm just going to hoard it for myself, Lord. Just confess it to him, tell him, and hoard it for yourself. The Spirit of God will be working on you, and your own heart will change, and then you'll be free. It won't take long. You'll say, I don't want to be a stubborn miser who hoards. I want to be partying with the Lord and be free of all this stuff. And look at all the Lord's given me. And he changes our perspective on our possessions, and he sets us free. There's a joy of worship and a joy of giving and a joy of sharing and celebrating all that God's done. And then the last part of the chapter, verse 28, it says at the end of every third year. So there's a special tithe on the third year. So every third year you bring a tithe out, and this goes for the Levite specifically because he doesn't have a portion, but also the poor in the land, the stranger, the fatherless, the widow, those that are very needy that are in the gates, they can come and eat. So every third year you take and set aside a tenth, and you just give it to people who are in trouble or in need. They're refugees. That's what a stranger is, a refugee. They've come from another place. They don't know any. Just bless them. Give them stuff. Help them. We have a lot of refugees in Sacramento area, don't we? From all over the world. Afghanistan, Pakistan, all those people that have fled from ISIS. There's a group of them that are here. We have people from all over Southeast Asia that have come here. We have a lot of people from Eastern Europe that have come here. We have people from all over the place. They've come to our area. They're strangers. So love them, bless them, help them, encourage them. That's what God's telling Israel to do, and it's a good principle. So chapter 15, as we looked at part of this morning, the first part of the chapter is related to the release of debts. He reminds them that every 7 years, verse 1, you grant a release. So whatever anybody owes, if they owed you, they can only owe you, they got 6 years to pay you back, and they're free after that. On the 7th year, you cut them free from their debts. This is a wonderful law that would affect the marketplace. Because now you're going to negotiate all your lending related to the fact that everything's going to turn over. So it becomes more reasonable. You're not really allowed to put people in these really abusive long-term debt cycles. You just can't do it because in 6 years they're free. So what they can't afford, they can't afford. So it's gonna affect the marketplace. And so no matter what, you got to release them. For the Jewish people, if a foreigner owes you, verse 3, well, you can hold them accountable long term, but every one of your brethren, he says, you have to set them free. And then it's interesting because he tells them, don't worry about it. Verse 6, he said, the Lord your God will bless you, just as he promised you. You're going to lend to many nations. You shall not borrow. You'll reign over many nations. They'll not reign over you. There's always that pragmatic personality that says, well, if I let them go, they're just going to take a mile. There's always that snarky, cynical personality. Well, what about that God just says, look just do what I tell you. It's going to be fine. If you release them, it's going to be fine. It's going to be better off. Just release them. You'll have more. And that's the way. The ways of the Lord are always better. Our natural man hates the things of the word. We don't want to submit to it, but God's always right. So he says, don't worry about it. God's going to bless you. I'll bless you. Don't worry. Just do it. And then verse 7, specifically, generosity to the poor. And the problem with generosity to the poor is verse 9. Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart. He said, look you go ahead and lend to people. You help them. They're in trouble and you got resources. They say, hey, can you help me? I don't have any food right now. Our crop got thrashed, or my wagon broke. It broke my leg. I couldn't plant. I'm in big trouble. He said, lend to the guy. And he says, your wicked heart. That's the problem always with the poor. Our treatment of the poor. It's my own heart. And then he says, what's my heart saying? Verse 9, the 7th year, the year of the release is at hand. The guy comes over with his broken leg and says, can't you help me? And you're like, I'm going to loan you enough for this year, and I'm going to release you the debt next year. No, I can't help you. I'm broke. I'm broke too. Oh, my leg's hurting me, Oh. He said, and then your eye's evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing. Then notice, he'll cry out to the Lord against you, and it'll be sin. Verse 10, you shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. Why? Because of this thing, the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and when all you put your hand to. So God said, you just give to him and just let me bless you. Let me take care of you. There's a great statement like this in 2 Corinthians when Paul's exhorting the Corinthians to give. He said, God is able to make all grace abound towards you so that you will have enough in any circumstance that you're in for any need that God's calling you to meet. So just give freely and don't worry about it. God will always provide. Then verse 11, this statement Jesus said, the poor, verse 11, will never cease from the land. Now note, look at verse 11. The poor will never cease from the land. Therefore, I command you, open your hand wide to your brother, to the poor, and to the needy. I've heard people use that phrase, the poor will always be in the land, as though it's an excuse to not give them help. Well, you always have the poor. Yeah, so help them. That's what God's saying. There's always going to be poor. Why? Because of our wicked hearts, because of the wicked systems and the difficulties of life, sin that's in the world. So because there's always going to be the poor, that's the reason for our generosity. So we don't want to use that as an excuse for no generosity. Then, starting in verse 12, the passage we looked at this morning related to not just the release of debts, but the release of people who've lost their freedom and they become slaves. So they're released after serving for 6 years. And the exception would be if somebody said, I don't want to go away. I love my master in verse 16. I don't want to go away from you, he'll say to his master. He loves you in your house and he prospers with you. So verse 17, in that case, take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door, and he'll be your servant forever. And also to your female servant, you'll do likewise. So the slave by choice. It's such a wonderful thought that I think we can't help as believers but read this and think, that's what we are. Jesus set us free, and we come to our master and say, oh, put my ear on the door, Lord, and mark me. And let me have the mark of a believer. Which, by the way, I don't think we're stepping out of line to say, what's the mark of a believer? You want to know if you're carrying the brand mark of Jesus? What are we marked by? By this, all men will know you are my disciples if you have good doctrine, a full church, a nice church, a lot of people. No, if you love one another. Love is the mark of a bondservant. You got to have love. So if you say, I want to have the bond mark, well, there it is. That's the one you want. And if you have that, people will be able to see that mark, and they'll say, all right, you're a follower of Jesus. Slaves by choice. The end of chapter 15, is a reminder of the firstborn. Chapter 15, starting in verse 19. The firstborn males, they all belong to the Lord. You don't do work with them. You don't shear them. So you don't profit from them. They all belong to the Lord. So you take them to the place that the Lord chooses. Unless there's something wrong with them. If there's a defect, then they're not offered to the Lord. But all the firstborn, if there's nothing wrong with them, they all belong to the Lord, and you take them to the Lord. If there's something wrong with it, then you just treat it like any other animal, and you can eat it, but you don't drink its blood. Chapter 16 is primarily a reminder, and I don't want to spend too much time on these feast days. The first 8 verses is a reminder of the Passover, some of the details of the Passover, but we've covered this already a couple of times. The one point I would make is in verse 3, right in the middle of verse 3, he says, that you may remember the day in which you came out. So note that. And then the next feast from verses 9 through 12 is what's called the Feast of Weeks. And so in verse 9, he says you count 7 weeks for yourself and count from the time you begin to put the sickle in the grain, and you keep the Feast of Weeks. So we've already covered that feast. But look at verse 12. That feast, he says, you shall remember. So the Passover is to remember that you came out of Egypt. And the Feast of Weeks is remember that God brought you out. And then the next feast, so there's 3. These are the 3 that they're required to participate in every year. So the next one is the Feast of Tabernacles, starts in verse 13. And that's when they make their booths and they keep the feast for 7 days. And so they're given that. But that one, it doesn't say remember. Look at verse 14. He says in verse 14, you shall rejoice. And then look at verse 15, the last phrase, you shall rejoice. So Passover, remember. Feast of Weeks, remember. Feast of Tabernacles, it's a party. It's just for joy. You set up the booths, you have a feast, you have a week-long celebration, you camp out in the yard with the kids. You make these booths with the kids, and the kids are sleeping outside. Why are we sleeping out? Oh, Dad, our fathers, man, we were out in the wilderness. God took care of us. And you have a big barbecue. Everybody has the time off. And I mean, what an awesome, imagine 4th of July we had 4th of July week. We didn't work the whole week. All we did is, we're just celebrating our independence. We're going to blow more stuff up. We're going to camp out outside and just rejoice and remember how God worked and set us free. And I mean, just what a great festival that would be, you know. So that was part of their thing. So their calendar. So verse 16, we're told 3 times a year, all the males appear before the Lord in that place that he'll choose. So Moses is anticipating. You go into the land, you end up with a place where the tabernacle is. Later it will be the temple, it's permanent. You all come back to that place, and for sure, even if it's far away on the other times, it's okay. If you can't bring the crop, then bring just the money, sell it, convert it to money, bring the money, it's easier to travel. Or you can't bring a burnt offering every day. You're not going to offer burnt offerings, but just go ahead and eat your animals and rejoice before the Lord. But these 3 you have to come. Verse 16 and verse 17. You got to come before the Lord. And then the rest, or verse 18 through 20 is about judges. And this sort of will be continuing into the next chapter. He tells them to appoint judges, to be careful in verses 18 and 19, to have just judges. Don't take bribes. Don't blind your eyes. Do what's just. Verses 21 and 22 are warnings again about worship. So we're going to have this repeated in this chapter, the next chapter. The next chapter is going to be, again, warnings about false gods. So don't plant trees as wooden images near the altar which you build for yourself. So he doesn't want any idolatry associated, and don't let a tree become a god. Now you might say, who makes a tree a god? I was in a village a couple of months ago on top of a mountain, and they worship a tree. Every village has a sacred tree, and I started to climb up to go take a picture of it because it told me it was a sacred tree. So being the American that I am, I thought, well, I'm going to climb all over the thing and check it out, you know. But I started to climb up the side of the wall, which I thought I was far enough away, like I wasn't desecrating it. But you're not allowed to touch the wall. that's on the other side of a walkway that's on the other side of this big open space before the special magic tree. They worship the tree. That tree provides protection for the whole village. People worship all kinds of things. So God said, don't be planting any trees around that someone's going to come along later and go, well, look at that tree. Trees grow. They stay there for a long time. They become magical, right? People worship trees. So God said, you ain't worshiping trees. And don't set up any sacred pillars. Look at verse 22. What does God feel about sacred pillars? He hates them. Some things God hates and some things are an abomination. So when people say, well, it's all the same. No, it's not all the same. Not according to God. These things are snares and they take your heart away from the Lord. And generally, these things represent nature. They represent natural forces, which generally take people away from the Lord. You start to worship nature and you leave nature's God, and you substitute the creation for the Creator. You can be amazed by the creation and think of the Creator, and that's wonderful. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the earth His handiwork. We should be able to enjoy nature and make it and celebrate it and see it for what it is, and it makes us think of the Lord. But once we don't have the Lord, and now we look at nature, and nature becomes God, well, now we're degraded, because nature is not God. A tree is not God. Neither are any of the animals or the stars or the sunsets or any other wonderful thing that God made. They're not God. So chapter 17, we continue with instructions about worship. In verse 1, don't sacrifice to the Lord your God a bull or sheep that has any blemish. So the things that are given to the Lord, they're perfect. That's important because ultimately Jesus is the sacrifice and He's perfect. So then the warning, verse 2, about dealing with the worship of false gods. Again, we've already covered this in chapter 13, but it's reiterated. Moses is emphasizing it in this section. If there's someone in your gates, a man or a woman who's been wicked in the sight of the Lord, and specifically transgressing His covenant, and they've gone and worshipped other gods, either if it's the sun or the moon or any of the stars, then you should find out about it, verse 4, and bring them to the gates, and they shall be put to death. Whoever, verse 6 says, is deserving of death. Now he's going to talk about specifically capital punishment, but in the context, it's worship, and if somebody is worshiping something other than God, it's a capital crime in Israel. So that was they're a theocracy, this is their law. I'm not saying that we extrapolate this and put it on other countries, but for Israel, that was the law. So now he says, when a capital crime has occurred, in this particular case, we're talking about one kind, but now he says in verse 6, he says, if there's 2 or 3 witnesses, there has to be 2 or 3. There can't just be one person. So if one person says, why I say it? Well, if it's just one person, then you don't put somebody to death for that. And then verse 7, the hands of the witnesses have to be the people who are throwing the first stones. Remember Jesus said, whoever's without sin, throw the first stone? So the witness would have to be, I saw him. Well, if you saw him, then you better be willing to administer the justice. So that's kind of heavy. And then more about judgment, verse 8, all the way down to verse 13, is the conditions. What if it's too hard for you, verse 8 says, to judge? What if it's some issue, it's a controversy, you don't really know about it, you're not sure what to do? So verse 9, then you come to the priests or the Levites to judge, and they'll pronounce the judgment. So whatever they tell you, you'll submit to that. If someone's acted presumptuously and then they won't listen, then that person should be put to death, and you put away the evil from Israel. And then all the people will hear and fear and not act presumptuously. So it's cause and effect. There's a lawfulness here, so you're under the law. If you're not under the law, you're going to be under the law. You're going to be outside of the covenant, and you'll be put to death. So the next section is very fascinating because it seems to jump way into the future. Look at verse 14. Did this seem weird to you when you were reading it? When you come into the land which the Lord your God has given you to possess, and you dwell in it, and then you say, I'll set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. So we've been talking about, watch out for false teachers. This is how you have judges. This is unclean. These are your festivals. Now, someday in the future, you might say, we want to be like everybody else and we want a king. Now, we've read the Bible, so we know. Does this happen? Yes. It absolutely happens. And is it good? It's not good. But already Moses, there's so much prophetic. Moses is such a prophet. He's such a wonderful prophet. He is talking about stuff that's going to happen, and he's giving them law and instruction for things that are not going to happen for hundreds of years. And so he says, you're going to say you want a king. So when that happens, here's some things for the king. And he just gives a couple simple things. There's actually, I think, 4. So the first one, if you're going to have a king, verse 15, he needs to be from Israel. He can't have a foreigner over you who's not your brother. So you can't have King Herod because he's not a Jewish person. He's an Edomite. So, he's got to be from Israel. So that's number 1. But then look at 3 prohibitions. Verse 16, he shall not multiply horses for himself. And he should not go back to Egypt to multiply horses because the Lord has said, don't go back there. You already were in Egypt, don't go back to Egypt. So don't go to Egypt. Now, why is that interesting to not go to Egypt? Because Egypt is pretty famous for horses. So don't go down and get any. Why does God not want the king to have horses from Egypt? Because you depend upon, horses are like a tank, right? Like if everybody else is standing there with a sharp stick and then some dudes come riding in on 100 horses and they got sharp sticks and they're coming at you at 40 miles an hour, it's a different ball game, right? So you start to depend upon your horses instead of depending upon. In Egypt, they depend upon the Nile. In Israel, you got to depend upon the rainfall. So you're depending upon the Lord. In Egypt, they got their horses. In Israel, man, we got the Lord. The Lord's going to deliver us. David didn't need a horse to take on Goliath. He just needed faith and a rock. So don't multiply horses. Then look at verse 17. What else are you not supposed to multiply? Don't multiply wives. And the reason is his heart might turn away. Now, this isn't specifically related that there's something wrong with having a wife. But if the guy becomes a king, it's very common in the ancient world. How do you seal a treaty except for by marriage? This guy gives his daughter to you, and she joins your. So you're pretty sure he's not going to probably attack you since you have a hostage. Maybe you give your daughter to him, and now you know, okay, we had peace, but my little girl's over there, so I'm not attacking. Well, my little girl's over there, I'm not attacking you. So now you end up with a harem full of all these people who don't follow the Lord. Does that sound familiar? Don't multiply horses, don't multiply wives, and then also in verse 17, don't multiply silver or gold. So not a lot of instruction. You need to be an Israeli. Don't multiply horses, don't multiply wives, don't multiply silver and gold. King number 1, King Saul. So he didn't really do that. King number 2, David. David had some wives, right? He multiplied wives. David multiplied gold and silver and saved it primarily because he wanted to see the temple be built. King number 3. He's famous for what? Wives and money and horses. When you go to Israel and you go to Tel Megiddo, this ancient site that overlooks the valley of Megiddo on the pass that comes over from like Caesarea, you're coming up and crossing over, you go past Nazareth and Cana, right? They're on either side, and you go on this road and you come over, and as you drop into the valley, there's this ancient site, and it's Solomon's stables. So I always think of this passage and I'm like, man, just want to write it like graffiti. Solomon's stables. What in the world are you doing, Solomon? You only got 3 things, bro. Yeah, I didn't do any of them. Dude, it's just 3. Just 3. No, I got a bunch of wives, I got a bunch of money, and I like horses. Oh, it's pretty simple. So the last thing is get in the Word. From verse 18 to the end. He said, it shall be when he sits on the throne, verse 18, he will write for himself a copy of this law in a book from the one before the priests, the Levites, and it will be with him. He'll read it all the days of his life. So here's the instructions for a king. Read the Bible. Don't get a bunch of money and don't get a bunch of wives. Don't get a bunch of horses. Read the Bible. That might be good for a president. We need to get a president. We need a new governor. Read the Bible. Don't have a bunch of wives. Don't be all about money, and don't be all about like your own thing. Just read the Bible. It's awesome. It's great. People say the Bible, the Old Testament. The Old Testament actually is pretty, so far so good. We're doing okay. I mean, it's good. Chapter 18 begins with the Levite. He reminds us, we've already covered this, the Levite doesn't have an inheritance, the first 8 verses. So remember, you have to bring all your sacrifices. They're going to keep part of the sacrifice. Verse 3, they eat from the sacrifice, and the first fruits you bring to them, and so that's how they are provided for. The Lord is their inheritance, and he'll take care of them. They don't have an inheritance in the land, so you've got to provide for them. And then chapter 18, verse 9, again, the warning about the abominations of the nation. So this has been a recurring theme in our section. So verse 9 says, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, you will not learn to follow the abominations of those nations. Now, what specifically? Now he's going to list them. You are not to make your children pass through the fire. So no child sacrifices. Now, does it seem like you should not have to say this? I never once thought of sacrificing my kids. Like, the car's not working. Bring one of the kids out. Let's offer them as a burnt offering. I mean, you think like, what? How? When do you think this? Well, when you worship your lust, you'll kill your kids. You worship sex, you're going to put kids to death. You start to worship your lust, it will be very dangerous to be a child in your society. You won't be safe at church. You won't be safe in the Catholic Church or any church or a school. Your kids won't be safe on the street if you worship sex. If you have a sexual revolution and all sex is free game and anybody can do whatever they want to do and everybody does what's right in their own eyes, a child is not safe anywhere. You better keep your eyes on your kids at all places when you worship sex. So what do you think we worship in America? Your kids are not safe. They're not safe here. We fingerprint every person who works in our children's ministry. You know why? Because we don't trust ourselves. And I mean any of us. We don't trust us. We're not to be trusted. We designed this building, so if you open these doors, those other doors can be open. You can stand at this end of the building and you can look all the way to the other side of the building. All of our children's ministry rooms have big, huge windows, so anybody walking by just looks in. There's no hiding places at our church. We don't shut these doors after the service when everyone's mingling. These doors don't close. Why is the church so wide open? Well, it's awesome. I like it wide open. But I like it wide open because it doesn't take me long to walk around and figure out who's who and who's where and who's doing what. And I see someone I don't recognize and they walk down the hallway. I'm really interested in who's walking where down the hallway and why. Because the kids are back there, right? Why is it like that? We worship sex. You can think whatever you want, do whatever you want, be with whatever you want, have sex with whatever you want. It's free for all. So what are the consequences? Your kids are going to pass through the fire. It's a fact. So it's an abomination. God hates it. So God said, I don't want any child sacrifices. There's different ways you can sacrifice your kids. Mammon worshipers, by the way, sacrifice their kids. If you worship materialism, the first relationship to go is a relationship with the family. When a man worships money, first relationship, husband and wife, wife is in the back. She's gone, forgotten about. The kids, they don't matter. It's money. I mean, we sacrifice our kids. Don't practice witchcraft. And then these are related specifically to trafficking in the occult or evil spirits. A soothsayer, someone who can interpret omens. Like somebody who would say, I saw a shadow around you while you were teaching. It was a male. And she had a message for me. And I was like, I don't want your message. I reject your message. That's a soothsayer, man. I had a grandfather who was a soothsayer. I know all about that stuff. I'm not interested in it. A sorcerer, someone who can conjure spells, cast spells, a medium, a spiritist. Somebody says, no, just come to me. I'll reach your I'll give him the message. You come and sit here and I'll look at your hand and I'll tell you, drink the tea, I'll look at the leaves. Someone who calls up the dead. Look at verse 12. All who do these things are an abomination to the Lord. Do not read the horoscope. Don't do tarot cards. Don't play the Ouija board. Don't see a psychic. It's an abomination to the Lord. And I'm not saying that it's not supernatural. Most of the time it's fake. It's just full-on hogwash, baloney. Okay? But perhaps you're talking to a person who's contacted evil spirits. They will tell you things that you could not believe. They'll know things that you cannot explain. They will have supernatural power. They will be able to tell you signs and wonders that can happen. You want to be really careful. It's an abomination. And God said, because of these abominations, God is driving these people out. So you need to be blameless. So we don't want any of that junk in our lives. So if you got it in your life or you're tempted by it, get it out of your life. God hasn't appointed you to that. Instead, he says in verse 15, God's going to raise up a prophet for you like me. So Moses promises them another prophet. He reminds them in verse 17, when they had said at Mount Sinai, they didn't want Mount Horeb, also Mount Sinai. They said, don't let the Lord speak to us. Remember, they were kind of freaked out, like the mountain's shaking and fire, like please don't have God speak to us anymore. They were freaked out by it. So God said, Moses reminds them what God said, verse 17, when they said that, the Lord said to me, what they've spoken is good. So what's the answer to the fact that at Mount Horeb we couldn't receive the revelation? And so God says, well, here's my answer to that. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I'll put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command you. Moses brought the covenant, but they couldn't handle it, and God says, well, I'll raise up another prophet. Who's that? Yeah, the word becomes flesh. And then we see this person, the children run to him, and he's blessing them, and the sinners are coming. They're not afraid of the mountain that's quaking, but people are running to Jesus. The sinners, the tax collectors, they're inviting him to their house, and they're having feasts. He's even accused of being a drunk, and a glutton, because he's so welcomed everywhere. Not like a mountain shaking, but this new prophet, and that his words people will be accountable. You need to listen to what he says. And the end of the chapter is the second test that I mentioned earlier. Verse 20, there could be a prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I've not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods. That prophet should die. Now, if you say in your heart, verse 21, how can we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? That's a good question. How do we know? We had earlier, chapter 13, they say a sign, the sign happens. How will we know? We look at what they're saying. Do they point to the Lord, or do they take away from that? So in this case, how will we know? But look at verse 22. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not happen or come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken, that prophet has spoken it presumptuously, you should not be afraid of him. So if they say this is going to happen on this day and it don't happen, dismiss them, right? 88 reasons why the Lord's coming back in 88, right? That guy wrote that book. You know the book he wrote the next year? 89 reasons why it's coming in 89. No one should have bought the second book. You probably shouldn't have bought the first one. But no one should have bought the second one. Why? Homeboy said it. Don't listen to him. There's nothing there. Joseph Smith predicts the millennial dawn, later becoming the Jehovah's Witnesses, predict. The Watchtower Societies predicted. And then it didn't ever happen. One false prophecy, God says. So this Bible, over 300 prophecies about the Messiah, every single one of them fulfilled. Prophecies about pagan nations, pagan kings named by name. The Bible itself says the test is one failure. How many of the prophecies of the Scripture have ever failed? Not one, not even one. Because if there was one, take the book and get rid of it. That's what I say. Because that's what God said. But they've all come to pass, and they all will come to pass. So that gets us to chapter 19. Don't worry, we'll finish this. We're almost done. Chapter 19, because some of this is a reminder, it's the cities of refuge. Remember that? If somebody accidentally killed somebody, we've already had this covered as well. So Moses anticipates their future growth, that you could escape to a city. So verse 8, if the Lord your God, or we'd say when the Lord your God, if you obey, then your territory enlarges. Then Moses says you're going to add more cities. So they start with these cities. There's 3 on the one side of the Jordan, 3. But as your territory enlarges, you may have to add more. And it's a place for the innocent. Someone wants to have a blood feud. They want to kill the person because this person, but they didn't know it was an accident. They're chopping wood, he says, and the axe head flew off. It's totally accidental, then the person can escape and you'll protect them and they'll be safe. The exception would be if you're guilty. That's verses 11 through 13. If the person premeditated this, if this was murder, the city of refuge does not protect the guilty. It only protects the innocent. So you still hear the case. What's the evidence? You listen to the evidence. Hey, this guy is an accident. He can stay here. He's safe. You can't come and get this guy. But if you killed him, then, there's evidence, then you send him out and they get put to death, for their murder. Verse 14 is just by itself. Don't move the neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have said. Don't move the landmark. Why is that important? Because it's the land that your fathers gave you. Don't come along later and kick the rock. This Joshua brought us into the land and we set the borders, man. We're part of a great, wonderful history. So don't move the old landmarks. And then laws for the judges. We've already kind of talked about that. The difference here is there's 2 or 3 witnesses, not just one witness. But this particular section, the emphasis is, what if someone's been a false witness? What if somebody says, I saw this guy do it, and then in the course of the interviews, you realize, this guy's a liar. So what does he say? Well, verse 19, do to the false witness as he thought to have done to his brother. That's going to, I want to see this guy put to death. Found out he's a false witness, so what do you do to the false witness? Well, he's going to chop his hand off. What happens to the false witness? Whatever the penalty was he's trying to get on the other guy, he gets on himself. So what do you think about false witnessing after that? You better think twice unless you want to be Popeye. Right? Verse 21. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. The last chapter is about warfare. And it's kind of simple. There's some simple rules here. It says when you go out to battle, the first rule is don't be afraid. Look at verse 1. When you go out to battle and you see horses, chariots, and people more numerous than you. I thought, when do we get to go out to battle and we're more numerous than them? That's not going to happen for you because you don't get to multiply horses. They're going to come with this great force against you. When you go out and you see insurmountable odds, what's your response? Woo, 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 woo. Exit, stage right. Zoink, Scoob. Every kind of cartoon character you know of, You're out of there. Don't be afraid, he says. So rule number 1, battle, don't be afraid. The priest will come up to the people when you're on the verge of battle. And he says, don't be afraid. He's going to give them an exhortation in verse 3. Don't be afraid. Don't tremble. Don't be terrified because God is with you. The antidote for fear is the awareness of the presence of God. You fight fear with an awareness of the presence of God. God's going to be with you. God's going to deliver you. Then the officers speak. And so they're going to sort of release people. So verse 5, the first one, if you built a house, he shout out to everybody, hey, whoever built a house, you guys just moved into a house? Go home. No sense in going out to battle and dying and somebody else lives in your house. So just, you got a new house, get out of here. You're free. How about verse 6? Who planted a new vineyard? That'd be me. I planted a vineyard. All right, get out of here. You're not fighting either. You planted a orchard, a vineyard. Someone else can eat the fruit of it. You go home. We don't want you to die. Then look at verse 7. Who got married? That's me. I got married. Okay, get out of here. You go home and take care of your wife. She needs you. You don't need to be out here. This is a really interesting tactic. We got a whole group of people. Hey, the enemy's coming out. We need to. Whoever wants to come on out. And then you go out there. Okay. Who got married? Okay, go home. Who's got kind of some new stuff? You got a new house? Who got a new car? Okay, all you guys with new stuff. Get out of here. He's thinning the ranks. Then, this is interesting. Look at verse 8. Then he'll speak further and he'll say, who's afraid? All right, if you're afraid, get out of here. Wow. You got new stuff? Get out of here. New wife? Get out of here. You scared? Oh, go home, man. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. We got it. We got a few crazy guys. We don't need a lot. One of us could chase 1,000. We figured that we got about 10,000. We maybe only need 10 guys because the Lord's fighting for us, right? If you're afraid. Now, why does he say that? Verse 8, Whatever man is there who's fearful and faint-hearted, let him go return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart. Fear spreads. Fear spreads even amongst the followers of Jesus. Doubting, fear, we can't do that. And boy, because we're ready to be afraid. We're all afraid. We're all right on it's thin ice, right? Our courage is about that thick. Like, okay, I'm out here. I'm walking on water. Someone said, like, we're going to die. We're not going to walk on water. Shark Week. And then all of a sudden, boom. What you need next to you is, we can do it. Let's go. Jonathan and his armor bearer. You just need 2 guys, man. 2 guys that aren't afraid. They'll take on the whole army. So don't be afraid. And if they're afraid, send them home. And then he tells them about how if they approach a city in the future, speaking of the future, if there's some time where you have enemies and they're outside your borders, if you come to the city, seek peace, offer peace, and put them under tribute. If they're going to war against you, and that's the result, then besiege it and wipe out the city. These are foreign enemies, and that verse 15, those are the cities that are far away. But verse 16, the cities that are in the land, then they're under the ban. You're to be totally destroyed, as God said. Verse 18 is why, so they don't teach you to do their abominations. The idolatry will spread, so those nations are judged and to be judged by God for their wickedness, and Israel's going to be the means of that judgment. And then the last 2 verses, really interesting, talking about war, and we'll close with this. Listen, he says, when you're making a siege, and you're going to chop down the trees to build, a tower so you can throw rocks on them or whatever, make a shield for yourself. He said, don't cut down the fruit trees. It's really interesting. It's like a real simple thing. It's just, if it's an apple tree, don't cut that one down. Cut the one that just makes pine cones or whatever. Like, get the other ones. If you see a other kind of a tree that's good for food, leave that. Why? God's going to give you the victory. I'm going to chop down all the stuff that God's blessing you with. So it's a super interesting way to end the chapter. You're probably never going to study this at West Point or Annapolis, the Naval Academy. You're not going to sit around and go, we need to talk about some of the biblical rules of warfare. Everyone who's afraid shouldn't fight. They don't say that. They just say, we'll shoot you if you don't fight. Here's a gun. They're going to shoot you. You're going to shoot back. Get out there. Right? I mean, that warfare is different. Not for Israel. You got new stuff, go home and enjoy yourself. You got a new wife, go home and enjoy yourself. We'll take care of it. And we just need guys that aren't afraid. I agree with that. I wish everybody was involved, but man, you don't want to be involved. You got a bad attitude or you got new stuff, whatever, do your thing. I want to serve the Lord with some people who aren't afraid. You don't need very many, just a handful. And just go do it. So I went a long time, but these are tough chapters. I promise to try to go faster, but it won't be for a while. Deuteronomy's tough. There's a lot, and some of this stuff I think is super important. The occult stuff, false teacher stuff, there's some things here, principles that extend into the New Testament and the New Covenant. So, Father, help us. Thank you for your word. Speak to us, encourage us, and help us, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.